And we're starting this afternoon with a topic that really has emerged over the last 7, 8 years, at least at API conferences, which is the API as a product mindset. And the API as a product term, but we'll see what does that mean, and also how to think it carefully to make it a success in your company. And for that, we have one of the best people to talk about it, which is Jason, who is Jason Harmon, CTO of Stoplight, and API expert, from the like say the
You can say I'm old, Mehdi. It's okay.
sorry.
It sounded like you're going to say from way back or something. You can just
Yeah,
say I'm old. It's okay.
I don't know, so long I don't even remember. So yeah, Jason, let's go about why you should treat your API as products.
Indeed. Thanks for the generous intro, Mehdi. Um, as Mehdi said, I'm Jason. I'm CTO at Stoplight.io. Kind of oversee all the geeky stuff, engineering, product, security, IT, all those things. And I think most relevant to today is actually hosting the API Intersection podcast has really given us a fantastic way to kind of learn what's working at successful programs. But I also have a background as a practitioner myself, not just working in sort of tool providing at places like Expedia Group or PayPal that you've probably heard of, and then other startups you might not have. So there you go. You have maybe reasons to listen to me. So my quick plug, and this will be it for Stoplight. We're an API design platform that you can think of as like the Figma for APIs. So we kind of help people, in larger places through their transformations, in smaller places trying to avoid having a future transformation. So simply put, we talk to a lot of folks that do this sort of thing, and hear from them what works and doesn't. And that's our attempt at API interface here is to kind of share some of our learning. So I think our kind of the basis when we think about how APIs have kind of come front and center to become products is we really have to ask the question, like, what's the business value? If you're a business leader, why do you invest in these things? And for me, the last 10, 15 years, I feel like I've spent more energy on this than anything, especially in kind of more product-ish roles. But I think we're over a hump now in the last couple of years. I really appreciated Van Alstyne's study that they published about in Forbes, that in simple terms, if you're really investing in APIs the right way, you will outgrow your competitors. So I think, we have this kind of business climate now where folks have started to key in that this is a very strong competitive advantage if done well. Over the last 16 years, these API first companies have shown a 38% positive growth versus their competition. So, for those folks here who are finding themselves in the realm of API product, this is a great one to point to if you have sort of exec types who kind of still don't get it. And that said, there's plenty of other great evidence. I'd certainly point to Postman's kind of state of the API thing. It was something like 98% of companies are investing in APIs now. So we have reached this kind of like, adoption hump, part of the adoption curve where it's a very mainstream thing now, right? But I think it's helpful from the business perspective, kind of the business community perspective, how these things are looked at is often a little different than we're used to in more kind of engineering circles. So I often call this, like, in the engineering world, we think of it in the MIT model of, we're building a distributed componentized system, and that's great. But when you're in the product realm, you need to be able to speak business. So what a lot of kind of leaders are looking for now, that I think is meshing well between technology and business is this idea of a composable business. And so I think it's really an analog to a lot of that kind of MIT oriented thinking in Harvard language. So composable business is the simple idea that, we've got these Lego building blocks we can plug together, this very modular way of building things. And I think there's implied in that a very customer-centric mindset. But for what it's worth, in a lot of places, if you really start asking the right questions, the reason that APIs are coming to the forefront is about building a marketplace. this idea that you're attracting producers of something, and then you have an audience of consumers who want to use that, and you're just facilitating that interaction. So we're all familiar with sort of the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world, but I think these concepts are spreading to many other businesses and creating a shift in thinking out of kind of the 80s, 90s MBA school of thought on pipeline-oriented business and into a more marketplace way of operating. So I call these things out in part not only to help sort of sell this on a business basis, but also just how to translate right into kind of terms that are familiar in the business world. So okay, I don't. You're attending an API interface, API days thing. You probably think these are important. I don't have to convince you. But with that backdrop, let's start thinking about how do we do this as a product. And my starting point with these discussions, when folks go, hey, we want to invest in API first, or whatever the latest tagline is that no one knows what it means. It's like, okay, what are you doing from a product standpoint? And a lot of times there's this wringing of hands, this concern that, well, we're doing APIs as products. We have to do something radically different. And I always like to remind folks it's just another product, right? Like, don't get wrapped around the axle with coming up with new ways of doing product management. You just have a different audience with different needs than maybe you're used to in kind of point and click or touch the screen kind of apps. This is a headless thing, so it does take some slightly different approaches. But the old school product management fundamentals work here just like it does in selling parking garages or storage units. It's just a product. So kind of our agenda, some of the highlights. If you attended my governance talk yesterday, I gave this kind of teaser on these kind of 3 areas of focus. One is kind of building off of or recognizing relationships and how you sort of frame your API projects, which sets us up for how to kind of gain that business buy-in and make sure that your product doesn't end up, one of the bodies littered on the road of API products. So there are many. And then finally, kind of how to think about testing and how you define acceptance criteria. So the first one, recognizing relationships. Before we get into it too much, this very simply is to say that if you build a really well, a really reusable concept as an API, this could be used by a wide variety of different consumers. And this is many times where people get stuck, is trying to sort of build, the one API that's going to rule them all and that you're going to figure it all out. And people will find themselves a year or two down the road having shipped nothing. So this is kind of a way to start thinking about that from the start. And first and most important, and you'll probably hear me say this a few times, is being customer-centric about it. It's really easy when you're working with engineering teams who are developing the APIs to have a very system-centric view of things. And it's almost impossible for API developers to not think that way. They can't help it. That's the world they're living in. So a big part of the product manager's job is to be the advocate for the API consumers. And so you can't do that unless you know who the customer's going to be. And that's, I think, job one for an API product manager is what's the audience that we're building this product for? Right? Which is, again, an old school product management thing. It's not a new idea. So a way to start figuring that out, and kind of step 2, is in most places there's already some kind of API, and it's probably not very good. And you want to make it better, and you want to reshape this into something that's going to be, a more reusable, modular, composable kind of thing. This is a common story. It's not that, there's really these days not a lot of folks that are starting from scratch. They're trying to improve on what they did before. So go talk to the folks that are the power users, right? Investigate kind of who's using it the most, who's generating the most revenue, whatever it is that the old model saw successful, and get them on the phone, right? Talk to them, figure out what's the job they're really trying to do, what are they trying to accomplish. This is a good leg up on figuring out what relationships might already work. And if you don't have that, there's probably in your sort of product management, requests, folks who are asking for things. And those who are asking interesting or innovative questions, go talk to them, find out what they need. Again, old school product management, right? Go talk to the customer. Don't get caught up in the numbers too much. And when you get down to that, some of the things you're really looking for, and these two kind of bullets are really about, let's separate, are we giving your customers their own data, or are we giving other platforms, your partners, access to that customer's data? And the reason this is super relevant right up front is it's going to radically change how you do authentication and authorization. And if you've never taken on one of these API projects, quite often that's the long pole in the tent. That's the hard part. You know, the old adage goes that if you're doing a 2-day hackathon, day 1 is getting everyone authenticated and authorized, and day 2 they actually build stuff. It's hard on everyone, right? But especially with the increasing vector of security attacks, it's important to think about this stuff very early. And I say that because, like, the scope of your auth that's going to be involved in this could radically change your kind of delivery timeframes. So, for example, if you're just providing customers their own data, they probably need a pretty simple kind of API token, API key type approach, as opposed to if you're trying to integrate with other platforms, you're going to need OAuth, right? You're going to need a way to capture customer consent to give access to their data to someone else. And that's a way harder thing to tackle. So these are just some of the basic practical reasons to ask it up front, but it's also that the functionality required is probably really different. And if you look at those two different things, you're probably looking at two different APIs because the needs are, significantly different. So think like a customer. To do that, you got to talk to customers. And customer in the API world could be partners. It could be actual customers. Or in some cases, it could be internal in nature only. And those customers are just other departments, divisions, whatever. So start there, get that part right. And don't get caught up in trying to boil the ocean of all potential scenarios as step 1. This is, kind of capturing the same concept, know who the consumer is, and the business relationship that you'll be building. And this is the other reason to start with relationships, is so that you can understand what's the commercial model going to look like around this. And if there's not a commercial model, i.e., it's something internal only in nature, what's the success measure regardless, right? If you go build this API, what is the expectation that you're setting that it's going to do for this company's growth? Old school product management, right? You got to justify stuff. Don't go build things that you don't have clear expectations on what it's going to deliver. And again, depending on the business relationship, those outcomes are going to look very different. So don't get caught up in boiling the ocean. This is true for technical standards too, for those sort of engineering types who are here trying to figure out what to tell their product manager to do. The same applies for, like, don't try to define every standard you can think of up front. Get what you need to go ship something and then refine. And the same is true with the product side. Pick a constituency, a relationship set, a business relationship type, get it right, and then adapt to the other relationship types. Okay, so we've done our homework. We've talked to customers. We know who we're building it for and what positive outcomes that it's going to produce. That's a great way to start justifying why something should be on the roadmap. And, in many companies, this is about convincing, I use executives loosely here, right? In smaller companies, this could, in some companies, this might be a director or whatever, but whoever your leadership is on the business side, they need to be bought in that this is a smart strategic move. So I'm going to say it again, API is no different than any other product. You need kind of the traditional business management to understand why this matters. So going off and building API products without that, it's not good. You're probably not going to finish that project. It's probably going to get canceled. But more importantly, I think for a lot of product teams is recognizing that building a one-off API for one use case, one relationship is a bad idea. We want something reusable that many relationships can be built from, which is really talking about building an API program. right? And this is going to be a partnership with engineering and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, if you're going to do all that and try to do something company-wide, you've got to have the business bought in. So a couple of things. Before you go ask for that meeting, before you have your roadmap update coming up or whatever, is how does the API that we plan to build fit into today's business model? And I say this because in many cases, these pushes toward, we're a traditional company that's going to become a platform company, and that's kind of the hand-wavy goal, is you have to accept that you're probably going to change how the business operates. And setting those expectations early is important. If you go do something that's going to upset the apple cart, these things can be seen as a threat rather than an opportunity. So if you already have a shift in kind of revenue happening from these traditional channels, perhaps into more integrated flows, it's good to set that context and that this is part of a bigger shift. If you don't have that shift, setting expectations on why this is a better approach, really good to get grounded. The second bit is, of course, back to success measures. How are we going to show when this actually launches that it worked? And I think one of the more naive mistakes in a common, kind of anti-pattern is we're going to measure how this API works on some technical operation measures. The typical one is like, here's how many calls we get to the API. Now, in some places, if you have something that an API call implies a business transaction, that could be a decent proxy to something meaningful. But in most cases, you're better off framing this around, kind of what the business measure is that API call affects. So, don't even show the technical operation measures if you can avoid it to kind of the executive crowd, because it's just completely alienating. Show what that call is enabling. And then finally, I said it before, is like, know when you're going into a marketplace. Know if this kind of API suite, perhaps, that you're planning out is going to shift things into a more marketplace-oriented construct. The idea that you're attracting producers, you're attracting consumers, and facilitating an interaction. Because you need to explain it in that sort of supply and consumption paradigm, rather than this sort of call the API and a transaction happens, right? It's going to be a bigger picture, more of a flow. And if you're not speaking in that language, it's not going to fit into their mental model. But, all of this kind of takes us to, if you're not putting the right business perspective around APIs when you put these things on the roadmap, it's real easy to kill as a project when the crunch comes, whether that be an economic crunch like a lot of us are facing now, or just general kind of business belt tightening. If business folks don't understand why the APIs are important and what they're enabling in growth for the business, it's going to be the thing they reach for to kill as, oh, this is a technical project, right? And I say this because the path to where we're at in the API world is littered with bodies. Right? Many things have been killed off that were great ideas because they didn't have the right business perspective built around them. So don't do that. And I think in a bigger frame of thinking is, again, you don't want to build a commoditized technical artifact, or you at least don't want to have that perception. And most times perception is more important than reality. So even if you're thinking of it that way, you need to make sure everyone else is thinking of it that way, that you've got great business alignment around it. But the other practical reason is you don't want to have an engineered experience. In the UX world, if we were building sort of a point-and-click interface as a product, which many product managers are used to these days, and we said we're just going to throw that to engineering, and there's a bullet that says do the thing, we would laugh at you and say, why aren't you including designers in that? Why aren't you putting studies and research into what's going to work well for a frictionless, great experience? The same is absolutely true for APIs. It's just a different audience, right? The end user doesn't point and click. They write code against it. And reminder, the tendency is things will fall into system-centric thinking. So go talk to that developer customer on how they see the world in terms of your product offering, and craft it that way, design it that way, be intentional about it. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin in many ways, is you're building justification for why you're doing these things, and you're building something that just makes sense to the end consumer and sets you up to fulfill those success measure expectations. All right, so we've got something on the roadmap, we've justified it, business folks are bought in, we understand what the customer needs. Your next step as a product manager is don't release buggy APIs. That are full of problems or dead ends and error handling and that sort of thing. Your acceptance criteria, I think, is going to look pretty different than what you would typically put to like a point and click interface. In that you're building a programmatic interface. It is inherently the most testable product you'll ever build. So you have no excuse for putting out big glaring bugs, and worse, or more importantly, you shouldn't be re-releasing the same bugs, right? You should be able to prevent these things from ever happening again if you release something to the wild. And this is all to say that, sort of automated acceptance criteria is key here. I'm always a fan of anything that's scenario-based in terms of tooling, meaning the test does not pass because one API call worked. It's very common that you're going to have flow in your API calls. So as a classic example in the payments world, kind of fintech, and something I was very familiar with at PayPal, you can't take a credit card transaction without an authorization. Thereby, you can't test that credit card transaction without testing multiple endpoints. And there's OAuth consent flows, which certainly makes it trickier, but this is to say that build a scenario-based acceptance criteria in your testing, so that you can say, user wants to do this, they get this, and a series of things happen to fulfill that, so that you make sure that from a developer experience standpoint, it all works together. Again, no real excuse for low quality in APIs in my mind. As a product manager, your sign-off process should be green lights. You shouldn't necessarily need to do, calling the API as a demo as a way to do sign-off. You should have testing up front that defines what you expected in very concrete terms, and those lights should turn green. And when they're green, you're good. And I'm just going to say this bluntly, as product managers, don't just trust when your engineers say the API is done. That's not good enough. That's, again, throwing things over the fence to engineering and expecting that you're not going to get an engineered experience. You will. And yeah, again, automation by default. That should be the default choice. It should only be very difficult scenarios that you're going to struggle to put automation around that might require some manual intervention. But by and large, you should be able to automate your testing here. This is not a brittle point-and-click user experience that's going to be flaky tests. These should be rock-solid, reliable tests, by and large. So with all that, one more little plug to you want to learn more about the API space, definitely come check out our API Intersection podcast. This is a community of practitioners who come together to really just share what works. We don't shill for any products. There's no sort of demos or selling things, especially Stoplight. So don't worry, we're not going to come pin you in the corner and sell stuff to you. And with that, we have time for questions.
We have a few minutes for questions. One question about in mostly larger organization about the potential sponsorship or leadership to think API as a product. Do you think it should come from the tech side, the business side, both from a lone nut thinking early, the API product mindset?
I'll say that what I see most commonly as the kind of not to do is that your technical organization, your engineering, will typically have some kind of, architectural push, and it might be, microservices oriented on how we're going to make independently deployable services, and we're going to modularize the system and clean up code and all that stuff. That's great. But that strategy should be in lockstep with the business strategy on what the APIs are going to enable. And I think if you don't have that business strategy plus the architectural strategy in line, then you're just going to be fighting back and forth for resources. And unfortunately, the business folks usually win when it comes to roadmaps.
One question about should all APIs must be treated as products? in a sense that I just take the example to relay on this. But like I was pitching API as a product to a bank. They were just having one API, one service, and an API on top to do like a compliance test. Like really something really on the back end thing. Will probably never be public. And they were telling me how much investment do I need to put to think them as a product. So so the question is like, should all APIs should be treated as product, or must?
I just switched my mic. Hopefully that gets rid of the buzz everyone's complaining about in the comments. Sorry, give me a recap of the question. I gotta get distracted by the mic thing.
No worries. Must or should all APIs to be treated as products?
Oh yeah.
Even internal ones, like internal ones, which are really really tiny or really for one use case.
Yeah, I got it. My advice is always build something that will not take a long time to externalize. Increasingly, I think there are lots of partnership opportunities to integrate with other platforms that enable business growth in an equitable way. And the struggle is if you say, well, this is just an internal API, we don't have to meet all the rules, we don't have to make this pretty, it just has to work, and it's not going to affect anyone, so no big deal. The problem is when you turn around and you have biz dev folks who say, we just signed a deal that in the next 60, 90 days, we're going to integrate with this other platform. And your engineering comes back and says, well, we kind of built a steaming pile of crap before, so we're going to need 6 to 9 months to completely re-engineer it. I think that's where engineering teams kind of get caught with their pants down, and it's not a good look. So my advice is always have most of your kind of standards that you would apply to your API development for something external, have most of those covered for your internal stuff. That way, when somebody suddenly says, can you ship this to the market and open it up to the world? The response is, sure, in about 60 days. We need a little cleanup time, but nothing massive. So I think for the engineering teams, that's good advice. And ultimately, that's what the product owners should be planning for, is building something that has future externalization potential. That's kind of the way to go. We started with internal adoption and shared leverage, but we laid the tracks to enable kind of further business growth. That's a way to get promoted as a product manager.
Yeah, so reduce the time to market, right, at minimum. Right. That's
absolutely.
Yeah. Perfect, Jason. Thank you very much. Thank you for this. And, see you at the next API conference.